We good? Okay. So we are starting with the American Revolution today. There's something that I think is important about starting this lesson. In a lot of other classes, you start the American Revolution and it's like Lexington and Concord, and then boom, it's signing the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of really important things that happened in the first 14 months of this war, and I want to explain those today. So that's my goal. My objective today is to understand how we go from Lexington and Concord and how we get to the framing of the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to start our day next class with the framing of the Declaration. So we have another famous John Trumbull painting. This is George Washington and his very famous warhorse, Nelson. Nelson became a celebrity in the post-war era. I'll explain that as we move into the early new nation. And again, today we're going to be talking a bit about Washington. So, after the bloodshed of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, like 2,000 Minutemen from New England, predominantly Massachusetts, are going to swarm around Boston. Questions?
2,000 or 20,000?
I'm sorry, did I say 2,000? 20,000. My bad. 20,000 militiamen swarm around Boston, trapping the British in Boston. This is kind of crazy because this militia force is going to outnumber the Brits. And Boston is going to be a location that Britain wants to hang on to, but they're ultimately going to have to let it go because there's not a lot of what in Boston that the Brits need to lean on. What group of people? A lot of those soldiers might be Anglicans. What I'm looking for, you're actually on the right path because a lot of these people would have actually been Anglicans. What I'm looking for is loyalists. Okay, there's not a lot of loyalists. We also refer to them as Tories. There's not a lot of loyalists in Boston. So the Brits are ultimately going to have to give up Boston, and they're not going to be able to have a foothold there. They're going to have to set their sights on New York. We'll get into that as we move into our lesson in our next class. So after Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress decides to have an emergency meeting in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775. There's no real intention of independence yet. They're not going in that direction. But remember that guy John Dickinson we learned about that read the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer that got circulated around the colonies? He is going to be the main author of a document framed in this meeting known as the Olive Branch Petition. And this Olive Branch Petition was sent directly to the king. And the goal of the Olive Branch Petition was basically to say, hey, let's settle for peace. Get your soldiers out of here. Enough with the taxes. Enough with the Intolerable Acts and the Declaratory Acts and all these things that are troubling us. Let us govern ourselves and let's try to prevent more bloodshed and stop this war that's about to unfold. Well, there's a problem, and we've already discussed this. This is going to take time to get to England. And it actually arrives, the news, the Olive Branch Petition arrives in England around the same time as the news of the first major battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is also technically known as the Battle of Breeds Hill. So the Olive Branch Petition, just like the previous documents we talked about, the Declaration of Rights and the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, is just going to be ignored. And the response is going to be more soldiers sent to America to put down the rebellion. The other thing that's important about this meeting is Congress decides to adopt measures to raise both an Army and a Navy. Now, this is a monumental task because obviously it's going to be difficult to get an entire Army unified out of these militia forces, but it's even going to be a bigger task trying to put together a Navy. So we're going to talk about this as we move forward because the Continental Army will get better as time moves forward, but the Continental Navy will struggle because it was really hard for them to develop a Navy from scratch. At this meeting, the guy that proposes that Washington become commander of the Continental Army was John Adams of Massachusetts. And there's a really rich, upset Massachusetts delegate here that wanted that job, and that guy's John Hancock. But why would you want George Washington as commander over Hancock? Any ideas?
He's a Virginian.
Those are both correct answers. He has military experience and he's a Virginian. Okay? John Hancock would have been great if you wanted to have somebody in charge of smuggling, right? But not a military commander on the ground. Washington was your guy. And I'm glad you brought up him being a Virginian. A Virginian will now be able to, if you pull a Virginian in, now you're getting a lot of soldiers, you're getting a lot of money, not a lot of money, but some money, and you're also going to hopefully be able to pull the South in as well. All right? So Washington wants the job. He shows up in his militia uniform at this convention, and he ends up taking command of the Continental Army in Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 3rd, 1775. What he arrives to witness is appalling to him because most of these soldiers are untrained, they have zero discipline, they have zero respect for command. He's really going to have to build this thing from the ground up to make it a functioning army. And there are going to be a lot of struggles that Washington faces in these early days. And there's going to be loss after loss after loss that the Continental Army will have to endure as a result. Does Cambridge sound familiar to you guys? Outside of Boston? That's the home of Harvard. Okay? Okay, so Washington as commander. He had never risen above the rank as of colonial militia colonel, even though he was technically commander-in-chief of the Virginia militia. His largest command before this date was 1,200 militiamen. Now he's got a command of 20,000, and those numbers are going to go up, all right? But he's got military training. He knows the terrain. He's a unifying presence. He's respected by his constituents beyond Virginia. He held himself as a very tall and confident leader. He's going to help boost morale. And he's kind of a legend in his own time because he had survived the French and Indian War. And it's kind of ironic, like, I don't know if you realize this, but in both of these wars, he actually has way more losses than wins. But he survived. And he had not put his army in a position to be destroyed in the French and Indian War, nor will he put his army in a position to be destroyed in the Revolution. He was patient, he had courage, self-discipline, a sense of justice. He also insisted on working without pay. He married a very wealthy, guys, stand here with me, please. He married a very wealthy woman named Martha Dandridge Custis. She was a wealthy widow. He is going to keep an expense report, but he puts up a lot of his own money for this cause. As I said before, he intends to get the job. He shows up in his military uniform. He's definitely got the right credentials for the job as opposed to anyone else. He's definitely the right choice over somebody like John Hancock. Hancock, though, will get a consolation prize. What will they give him to keep his money flowing and to also get him to chill out a little bit?
Like Oh,
They give him a really high-ranking position, not in the military, but where?
oh, I guess.
Yeah,
Is he a secretary?
he's president of the Continental Congress. That's why his name's signed on, like, large on the Declaration of Independence. He's got a bit of an ego. So, as we mentioned before, Washington takes command on July 3rd, 1775. So, Bunker Hill and the Hessians. Washington takes command outside of Boston. The British soldiers are still in Boston. How are they going to be pushed out? Well, they really can't do a whole lot until they get cannon and gunpowder and bullets and guns. They are not equipped, even with 20,000, they're not equipped to take on the Brits yet. Just not prepared. So it's pretty interesting. In the first year of the war, the loyalty of the Continental soldier was pretty impressive. But over time, this starts to wane. And this was something that bothered Washington too, where soldiers would be like, okay, see ya, I'm going home. What? Yeah, I gotta go deal with my farm. I'll be back. That's not productive, right? For soldiers to just be coming and going when they've got to prepare for battle against one of the most well-trained armies in the world. So a really important early turning point for the Patriots will come in May of 1775. An American force led by a really interesting militia force known as the Green Mountain Boys. These guys were from like Vermont, Connecticut, upstate New York, parts of western Massachusetts, and parts of New Hampshire. They're led by Ethan Allen, like the furniture place, and Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor. These forces are going to take two really important British forts on the frontier. They're going to take Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain and Fort Crown Point. Both of these forts were in upstate New York, all right? What this will allow for is the Americans to get much needed cannon, gunpowder, bullets, and weapons. And the guy that they are going to get to move all of this war material out of Appalachia to Boston is a guy by the name of Henry Knox. Knox is a really interesting character in the Revolutionary War. He had been a teenager involved in the Boston Massacre on the protest side. He was a volunteer that got involved in artillery. He gets the nickname the Ox Knox because he's a big fella, but he also leads an oxen wagon train to get all these supplies to Boston. All right. This kind of somewhat saves the early effort, and had this not happened, it's probably the Brits may not have actually evacuated Boston. So this is a pretty important cause and effect. Henry Knox will ultimately go on after the war to become the first Secretary of War under Washington. So by mid-June, June 17, 1775, the Continental Army is going to seize the high ground at, this is super confusing, Breed's Hill. But for some reason, we continue to call this event the Battle of Bunker Hill, when technically this battle occurred on Breed's Hill. This is an insanely confusing battle, okay? So they have the high ground, they've got artillery, but they don't have a lot of gunpowder, they don't have a lot of cannonballs, and they certainly don't have a lot of bullets. So the Brits, under the command of General Thomas Gage, decide they're going to just, Gage is going to issue this order for General William Howe, who will ultimately replace him as commander General William Howe and the Brits are going to march right up the hill and take the high position. Why is this not a great military maneuver?
Because then you're visible.
Yes, you're totally exposed, and all the Continental Army Massachusetts Minutemen have to do is fire downrange, downhill. So in this frontal assault led by the Brits, the Americans are just mowing them down, one after another. They just keep marching uphill, mowing them down, to the point that one of the commanders for the Continental Army, William Prescott, will famously say, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The reason he said this was because they were running so low on ammo and on gunpowder that he wanted to make sure every single shot counted. They legit fight until they run out of ammunition, and then they have to retreat. So what makes this battle even more confusing is that the British actually win this battle, but they don't. It's a huge moral victory for the Americans, because the list of casualties, American to Brits, this is the most lopsided battle of the war for American casualties versus British. The British just took on way more casualties as a result of this, but they took the high ground. The Minutemen and the Continental Army retreat, winning a moral victory, losing a tactical victory. However, they still have the Brits surrounded. And ultimately, the Brits are going to have to abandon Boston. Not yet. It's going to take time. As previously mentioned, the news of Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, arrived in Britain about the same time as the Olive Branch petition did. So the door is going to be slammed shut on peace. Also, this is when the Hessians arrive by George III to go serve with the British Army and fight against the Continental Army. And remember, the Hessians from the Hesse Castle region, they were an advantage for the Brits for the first year of the war. But as their contracts ran out, they either went back to Germany, north to Canada, or west and settled in America. And a lot of those mercenaries ended up becoming American citizens after the war. So on the top left, the Green Mountain Boys. Top right, Henry the Ox Knox. And that is Fort Ticonderoga that sits on Lake Champlain. Isn't that beautiful? Pretty awesome. Remember, that was an old French fort that the Brits had taken during the French Indian War. Okay, the Canadian quagmire. This is really important. The Brits decide, as they're trying to mobilize soldiers, and they're having a very hard time on figuring out where they're going to land these soldiers. That's why they're going to abandon Boston and put their sights on New York. They decide to lead sort of a naval engagement on coastal ports. The first major coastal port that is attacked will be in October of 1775, and that'll be the burning of Falmouth, what is now Portland, Maine. Which, what New England good a lot of came out of there that people enjoyed tremendously? Rum. Who said that? Excellent. Yeah, a lot of rum production came out of Falmouth. Okay, so the burning of Falmouth is like a moment where the Continental Army the Continental Congress realizes we've got to get a navy, but the navy, building up the navy, is going to be slow going. The Patriots, to take pressure off the coast, decide on an overland campaign to Canada. Now, in their minds, they think that the French Canadians, who are now under British control, are bitter by having lost their land and their identity after the French and Indian War, and they're going to waltz into Canada focused on what two cities on the St. Lawrence? Quebec and Montreal, very good. They're going to roll in there, and the French are going to be like, oh, thank goodness, our American cousins are here. let's wage war against the Brits. Not so much. The French were perfectly thrilled with the Quebec Act that had been passed in 1774, and were not interested in taking up arms against the Brits. Now, there would be some French that defect and French Canadians that defect and fight with the Americans, but not on a large scale. So, two commanders in this campaign, American commanders, Richard Montgomery, Continental Army soldier and general, and Benedict Arnold, one of the leaders of the Green Mountain Boys. They will take Montreal in the late fall, early winter of 1775. Then they decide to move farther downriver to take control of Quebec. But here's the problem. Have a great one. What's the weather like in Canada in December? It is freezing. They think that they're launching an assault on Quebec, and it's a surprise attack. It is not. The Brits know that they're coming, and they also attack during a blizzard. Not a great look. Once they get into Quebec, they're sitting ducks. Richard Montgomery will be killed. Numerous Continental soldiers will be wounded and captured as prisoners of war. And Benedict Arnold was wounded and narrowly escaped alive. He'll be wounded a couple more times before the war is over. This is the end of the goal to try to take Canada. But the losses were great. You lost a leading commander, you lost soldiers, you lost vital supply, and this is going to open up the door for a Canadian-based campaign that we're going to learn about soon. So, not only will they lose Quebec, they also will lose Montreal in hopes of gaining the French Canadians as allies. In January of 1776, the Brits burned Norfolk. Norfolk? Why Norfolk? Why would you want to burn Norfolk to the ground? It's a what? It's a major depot for trade, right? It's a major port, all right? And Norfolk would have also given the Continental Navy the ability to potentially do what there? Anybody? What does the Navy need? And they need boats, right? They need ships. So burning Norfolk would have prevented them from being able to build ships there, okay? March of 1776, the Brits were forced to evacuate Boston, so they're out. Boston will remain in Continental Army hands for the remainder of the war, but the Brits are now going to focus on New York, and that will be their base of operation. Also, Thomas Gage is replaced by General William Howe, who was the leader of soldiers at Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. In the South, the Patriots won a moral victory against 1,500 Loyalists at Moores Creek Bridge in North Carolina, and they also staved off a British fleet attempting to take control of Charleston. However, rough news, Charleston will ultimately fall to the British. So that we'll deal with a bit later. Okay, so on the left we have Richard Montgomery, and on the right we have Benedict Arnold. Where are my Hokies at? Hokie. Just one Hokie? I don't believe that. Hokie. Anybody else? 2 Hokies in the house? That's it? Been to Blacksburg? Hands up. Anybody been to Blacksburg? Okay. If you've been to Blacksburg, you've gone to Montgomery County. If you're wondering the namesake of Montgomery County, that's him. Richard Montgomery. Okay? So, Montgomery County, Virginia. Named for Richard Montgomery. This is where we pump the brakes today. Thomas Paine preaches common sense. Thomas Paine is kind of like the British version of Sam Adams. He was a failure in nearly every business venture he set out to do. He also had attempted to become a tax collector, but then utilized that position as a means of protest. And he ends up coming to America to become a champion for independence. Under the pseudonym Plain Truth, Paine is going to write one of the most important pieces of literature of the Revolutionary era, Common Sense. 50-page pamphlet published in Philadelphia by Robert Bell. The gist of Common Sense: he wants to urge the common man in America to stop the war of inconsistency, stop pretending loyalty to Britain, and to fight. So, Paine argued that it was unnatural for an island to rule a continent. He also called George III the royal brute of Great Britain. He will lay out a list of detailed grievances that America should have: Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, Declaratory Act, Townshend Acts, Quebec Act, Intolerable Acts. The list goes on and on. He's laying all that out, okay? These grievances are going to be adopted by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. When we go over the Declaration of Independence in the next class, that document's going to feel a little plagiarized because so many of the ideas that Jefferson puts into that document are borrowed from both John Locke and Thomas Paine. All right? So, again, these are not new ideas. They're just put into writing for all to see. Within months, like 6 months, 120,000 copies of Common Sense are sold and circulated throughout the colonies, getting the war effort promoted. He donated every penny he made to the war effort, which is pretty impressive. However, he never really just couldn't get in the inner circle of the Continental Congress. And by the end of the revolution, he's actually going to go on to France to get involved in their revolution. And he narrowly escaped the guillotine. We'll talk a little bit more about him as we move forward. He's also the author of The American Crisis. So here we have Thomas Paine and Common Sense. Do you guys have any questions? All right, cool. And that's our day.